Welcome back, everybody. Sorry, my camera has decided to fall over. I'll hold it up. It's great that you're joining us for this final session in today's Rainforest Alliance section for the Global Landscapes Forum. I think so far we've had the opportunity to hear from a number of people who have had rich experiences in how to make alliances work for real lasting landscape level change. This session will be looking a little bit more at how we measure that impact and how we can communicate more clearly. Communicating simple yet accurate statements of impact to donors and investors and other stakeholders is crucial to strengthen our work at the landscape level. And LandScale, which this session will be looking in more depth at, is an initiative that Rainforest Alliance is proud to be working on with Vera and the CCBA, looking at how we can take that landscape level impact, but also really ensure we are measuring it and adapting with that knowledge. In this session, we'll be looking at measuring landscape level performance with learnings from the cocoa landscape in Ghana. And then we'll be moving into an interactive workshop where we'll get the opportunity to explore how organizations can credibly communicate landscape sustainability performance. Before we get started, this is slightly different to the previous two sessions, as there will be more interaction in those breakout groups. So as you log in, if I could ask you to click on the participants and change your name so that we can see your names in the boxes when we get to the breakout groups. And in this first part of the session, if you are not going to be able to participate in the breakout groups, then please let us know in the chat box because we will be assigning people into breakout groups. So we want to make sure that you are evenly distributed. For the first part of the session, do please keep your mute on and you can switch your videos off. But when we go into the breakout groups, we'd like to ask you to keep your videos on and obviously make sure your microphones can be unmuted. Feel free in the intervening time to start introducing yourself in the Hoover and Zoom chat boxes. And through the next hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes, we look forward to hearing more from you and learning more about how together we can create lasting impact. I'm very delighted to welcome and introduce Rebecca Ashley Asori from the Director of Programs and Research at Nature Conservation Research Centre in Accra, Ghana. Welcome. She is the continental lead on cocoa agroforestry and REDD+, and is well known for her determination and commitment to achieving impact through socio-ecological approaches. As well as her extensive experience in climate-smart agriculture and payment for eco-service models, she's also worked on community-based conservation, landscape governance, and landscape standards. For over 5 years, Rebecca has supported the government of Ghana to develop its groundbreaking Cocoa Forest REDD+ program, which is the first commodity-based emissions reduction program in the world. Since 2018, she's partnered with private sector cocoa companies to implement landscape approaches to reduce deforestation and improve sustainability across multiple sites in Ghana. We're delighted to welcome Rebecca, who's going to introduce us to some of the examples and experience of using LandScale in Ghana. So I hand over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Emma, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I'm excited to have the chance to talk to you about our experience with LandScale. Just to give a little bit of background, NCRC is a Ghana-based African NGO. We specialize for the last 25 years in developing ecotourism programs and community-based natural resource management that really creates economic development that leads to natural resource conservation or sustainability. And like Emma said, we've really moved forward many things here on climate smart agriculture, on REDD+, on community-based landscape governance, both in Ghana, across the sub-region, and then in the Horn of Africa as well. So thank you. Let's get started. What I want to talk about today is to give a general overview of what do we mean by landscape approaches. Generally, what are landscape approaches? And then specific to Ghana, what are the cocoa landscape approaches that we're using in the country? and then talk about them in the context of initiatives that are actually trying to measure sustainability and performance in these landscapes. There's sort of a network of initiatives coming together under that LandScale is connected to. And then in particular, in the two landscapes where we're working, how do we actually use the results of LandScale to drive change, to drive sustainability in those landscapes? So that's the general overview of what I want to share today. And I think Emma said this, but if you have any questions, I think the best is let's save them till the end of the presentation, or feel free to send them in the chat box and the team can compile them. So when we talk about landscapes, I think most of us know what a landscape is, but it's always good to make sure we're on the same page. What we're talking about are large areas of land made up of both natural and human modified ecosystems that share similar characteristics. So these are landscapes that have the same climate, the same geology, soils, vegetation, aquatic systems, and then they're bound by either human influenced boundaries or natural boundaries. So for example, a landscape may be bound by major roads. It might have traditional jurisdictional boundaries. It may reflect state, government, district boundaries, or the natural boundaries, right? Rivers, mountains, a transition from savanna to forest. So in Ghana, we're working in tropical high forest landscapes that have a mosaic of cocoa production at the scale of about 100 to 200,000 hectares. But they include farms, forest, protected forest, unprotected forest, towns, roads, so they're quite diverse. And when we talk about a landscape approach, what we're really focusing on here is that there's a major shift happening, and I think this is an important thing to recognize. It's a shift in focus from the farm, the farmer, the society scale of engagement to a model that actually orients itself outward because it needs to address critical environmental, social, and climate issues. And the truth is that these issues extend far beyond individual farm boundaries. They go into the surrounding communities, into these landscapes. And so we need to make that shift and adopt landscape approaches to be able to tackle them. So when we're talking about a landscape approach, generally speaking, what we mean is that we need to have landscape governance and/or some type of management planning process in place. We need collaborative, multi-stakeholder processes reflecting who is working, investing in the landscape, and that they are now coming together to work together. We're focused on the adoption of sustainable production goals across these stakeholders with natural resource commitments like a no deforestation commitment. And then there's an element of performance-based monitoring or measuring socioeconomic impacts or outcomes. So that's the basic picture of what a landscape approach is. To be frank, the reason that we need to be thinking at the landscape scale is because the fate of the world's forests, climate resilience, sustainable production, these are not farm scale issues. We cannot address them at that scale. We need to go to a landscape scale. And it won't be possible to achieve our forest commitments if we don't. In addition, we often find that while there's some very good interventions into landscapes, the majority of farmers or farms in those landscapes do not benefit from these farm scale initiatives. So if we want to meet our commitments, we need to forge collaborations. We need to be multiple companies, multiple stakeholders with government, community leaders working together to be able to really hit and address the landscape. And then another point here is we should be prepared for future regulation. And so now is the time to take this new approach. Otherwise, we may find ourselves trying to catch up with the regulations and monitoring that may come down the pipeline from, let's say, something like the European Union, as well as public opinion. So in Ghana, we are, just to give you a picture here, the landscapes where we are working at NCRC and with LandScale, they're predominantly cocoa production landscapes. We're the lead partner, but we have many partners whom we are working with across government, private sector, other civil society organizations. The big challenge here that brought this approach together is the high rate of deforestation and forest degradation. And it's because cocoa over the last century has been a driver of deforestation as farmers have progressed farther into the forest and expanded the cocoa production landscape. But we also do have challenges with illegal logging and with illegal mining. So if you think about what is our approach, if you take this general idea of a landscape approach and we put it in the Ghanaian cocoa context, what we're really talking about in the 2 pilot landscapes where we're working is we have a combination initiatives that are focusing squarely on developing landscape government mechanisms while also implementing climate smart agriculture, climate smart cocoa extension, resources, information to farmers. And we're coupling that across a suite of stakeholders with landscape monitoring. And then on top of that, we're bringing in LandScale. You could use another standard, but LandScale is the most developed. And so we're monitoring, we're assessing and then monitoring the progress of these initiatives through LandScale. So LandScale becomes that framework for assessing how have these initiatives or made change or will be making change over time, and does it meet a standard of sustainability? If you're familiar with the context of Ghana, in 2017, Ghana's Cocoa Forest Red Plus program was accepted into the World Bank Carbon Fund portfolio. So they have now signed an ERPA. Ghana is working to produce emissions reductions across a 6 million hectare landscape, where we're reducing deforestation driven by the cocoa sector. And what's really, really cool is that while this was a largely government-led initiative, private sector cocoa chocolate industry came in the same year and made a commitment to a no deforestation supply chain in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire. So you now have private sector investment coming to really finance this programmatic approach that's been put in place. And at the same time, Ghana's Cocoa Board has come forward to say we want to develop a climate smart cocoa standard for the country. And this has been a progress and evolution from what was developed to some extent under the private sector and is now coming into the government's realm. But what's key in all of this, the GCFRP, the Ghana Cocoa Forest Red Plus program, it will really be focusing on the carbon accounting. But when companies come out and say, we have had an impact because we say so, or when a government says, we have done climate smart cocoa and this is our standard and we can say it works, you can't verify yourself. It actually doesn't hold water. And so we're using LandScale to actually help us stay accountable, not because we as Ghana say it, but because the LandScale assessment helps us to demonstrate that impact. So LandScale in this context becomes this standardized approach to assess sustainability outcomes in defined landscapes, and then to help us take them forward towards improvement with the main commodity being cocoa. So the effort of developing LandScale, from the idea to where we are today, where we've been able to start testing the framework, it's really been a bottom-up, multi-stakeholder, transparent process. There's a secretariat, as you can see, but many partners are included. There are 5 pilot countries, including we have Ghana, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Peru, Mexico, and now other countries are being invited on board. And then a suite of advisors. So it's been a very up-down, you could say north-south iterative process with really good input coming in. And we've also had the first public consultation. LandScale has, the way that it's set up is it has 3 main components, okay? The first and sort of the heart of LandScale is an assessment framework. So this assessment framework will show you what are your goals, what are your indicators, what are your performance metrics. What's unique about LandScale and what is very much appreciated here in Ghana is that it's focused on outcomes and not practices. So we're not setting a bar and saying you have to hit here. We're monitoring progress over time, and we want to achieve outcomes that are defined either under the standard or more detailed by the landscape. And then when you go through an assessment, when you conduct an assessment via this framework, then there's the possibility to have a verification mechanism. So we're now developing and putting in place a process for evaluating the accuracy of that assessment. And we're now playing with the idea of, do we want third-party independent verification? Do we want a second party, maybe somebody designated within the consortium of stakeholders to conduct that? So actually on this particular piece, if you have an opinion and experience, LandScale is very open to what would be interesting, usable, valuable, etc. And then the third piece is a reporting platform. So you go through the assessment framework, you need to report. And so we're now in the process of putting together both making data sets available to help fill data gaps, have a platform for managing data, and then a process for how do we analyze and verify and visualize those results. But this is right now a work in progress. So the first step, if I can walk you through the steps of LandScale, is you actually have to define your landscape. You have to say what is in and what is out and why. Then you need to select your indicators and metrics, and then you move into conducting your assessment. So in Ghana, I'll show you in a moment, we've selected 2 landscapes and put together sort of a baseline assessment, making the case for why those 2 landscapes. In that process, as we've followed it, we have chosen jurisdictional boundaries. The reason being that the government of Ghana in the GCFRP, in this Ghana Cocoa Forest Program, has designated what we call hotspot intervention areas. And they're hotspots of forest and hotspots of cocoa production. But they're actually bounded by district boundaries. And they've been brought together into 2 or 3 district clusters. And so the boundaries of these HIAs, as we call them, are actually jurisdictional, local government jurisdictions. So we have 2 landscapes we're working in. We try to bring bring a range of factors. So a range of deforestation pressure, a range of levels of cocoa production, variations in the complexity and characteristics of stakeholders, as well as forest types. And so what you can see is the first landscape, Juabi-Sobia, it's in the northwest of Ghana's high forest zone and cocoa production landscape, the big landscape. It covers 2 districts. You can see the black boundary. It contains some forest reserves in light green, a national park, and then a whole, thousands of communities. The main partners here are the Partnership for Forests, DFID funded program, with Touton, which is a French cocoa buying, trading, processing company with strong sustainability performance track record, NCRC, and a suite of other government and civil society organizations, including the Forestry Commission and the Cocoa Board. In Kakum, which is also in the high forest zone cocoa landscape, but much farther down in the transition, just before the transition from forest to the coast, it's got a national park as well, which is quite famous, a smaller forest reserves, and then a major cocoa landscape with other products like oil palm and some citrus, similar to Juabi-Sobia. Here we're working in partnership with the Hershey Company and with Ecom, which is another agro-trading company, and then a suite of government agencies. And this partnership is now growing. We have a couple of other companies we're in the process of bringing on board. So the next step is, when you've defined your boundaries and you know where your landscape is, you need to start to think about, what are our core indicators? LandScale will have core indicators that every landscape has to be able to assess, and then there'll be some landscape specific indicators. So your core indicators fall under 4 pillars. We have ecosystems, human well-being, governance, and production. So this is the holistic picture that encompasses sustainability at that landscape scale. And every pillar will have at least 1 core indicator, but as you can see, some pillars have many more. in particular governance. And once you've basically accepted, we have these core indicators, then a landscape and a stakeholder group working there will start to choose their landscape dependent indicators. So this, you go through a process of saying, is it relevant to our landscape, and how important is it to LandScale, and a yes/no decision process, which is mapped out. In Ghana, as we've tested the version 1. So let me say that the LandScale framework, we have a version 1 that has gone through a public consultation, and it's now being revised, redrafted, and that version 2 will be coming out in a few months' time. But we've tested, in the test of that version 1, we went in our process of selecting indicators, as you can see here, under the first pillar, protecting and restoring ecosystems, we had to choose ecosystem conversion. That was a core indicator. But then we looked at 2 others, natural ecosystem degradation and ecosystem restoration. And what we said for both landscapes was degradation is very important. It's a big problem in Ghana in these cocoa landscapes. We have a progressive degradation leading to deforestation. So it's a trend, there's a risk, and it's something that's going to be monitored under government programs as well as private sector initiatives. So we ended up selecting both because there's also a vibrant plantation, reforestation program in place. So again, it's a priority for the country, and it reflects in both landscapes. As another example, on 1.3 here, we've started to look at let's select water quantity. But in the process of reviewing that and thinking about it, we came to a point where we said, we don't actually know for sure if we can do that. So this is something that we're still trying to work out. And water quality, this is something we're more confident about, that between treatment plants that may come at the, Khartoum has a treatment plant not inside the landscape, but some, tens of kilometers south, or through some monitoring efforts in the landscape. Rivers are important, so let's start to figure out water quality for our landscape. And then on the greenhouse gas emissions, this is a very high priority for the sector, for the landscape, for the government. So this will be something else that we selected here. So you can see it's a process of thinking critically and figuring out what makes sense and what might not make sense for landscape indicators. And then the next step is, if you've chosen your indicators and you know your landscape, and you're assuming you have a group of stakeholders together, including community leaders and farmers and the people who really live there, we need to start to collect the data. For LandScale, it'll be probably in a 2-year, every 2 years, you would assess progress. In this process, it's important to start early on thinking about how do we get data to assess and report not farm scale impacts, but land scale impacts and outcomes. Project level data, project level reporting doesn't usually reflect a whole landscape. And so there's a lot of work needed. This is actually why you need a multi-stakeholder approach, because no single individual entity can furnish all the data that's required to be able to talk meaningfully about making change towards sustainability in a landscape. And so we in Ghana are now in a really, what I would call a rich process with our partners in thinking about where is this LandScale data going to come from in those areas where we found a challenge. And so let me give you a little bit of an example here. Here's just a few indicators out of our test of the assessment framework for both landscapes. And what's interesting is you can see that across both landscapes, there's, Khartoum, 24% of the population is below the poverty line based on statistical service data, based on a census. In Jurisdictional, it's 14%, but this census is only carried out every 10 years. So actually the census data is quite old. It doesn't align to LandScale's time frame of assessments. And so we've started to think about what are other methods or sources of data. And we've been exploring more research that's been done in the landscape using multidimensional poverty indices And what we can see is that, yes, okay, if you go up to the census data, there's, let's say for Kakum, a quarter of your population is below the poverty line. But for the same Kakum, if you use a more broad approach and concept of well-being, there's 41% of the population don't have access to basic services. And why this is important is because sustainability is not just about production, it's also about human well-being. So now we have to ask ourselves, access to electricity, access to water, access to schools, these are not things that a cocoa income per se can change. And so you actually need to start to push government, you need to start to push private sector, you need to take a different approach to say, how can we make a shift, a meaningful shift? It may take time, but how could we move these numbers so that a higher percentage of a population has access to something like basic resources? And in a similar vein, government has production data for cocoa. So we want to know we're succeeding in conserving forest, but we're actually raising the bar on productivity for farmers' benefits, right? Yields tend to be low. Ghana has some of the lowest yields in the world for cocoa. How can we help increase yield, but do it in a sustainable way? We can get farm level data, but is the average productivity for a farmer, the average yield across the whole landscape is much harder. And how do we get the whole landscape production data? Government has it for particular areas, but it doesn't align to these boundaries. So this is actually a place where we've sort of been scratching our head and are now talking with the World Cocoa Foundation on, is there a pre-competitive way that companies can share their IP, share their productivity data, but make it available for something like LandScale? So that's become a really interesting discussion. We're at the beginning, but I think we're gonna find a solution on that. And then sort of, we go through these, we've tested it. We have an advisory working group in the country of private sector, NGOs, government representatives from the cocoa sector. And so through this whole process, we go back to the advisory working group, sits down to discuss, and what has come out clearly is that the value to these cocoa companies, who can be very competitive with each other, is that they have made statements. There's a Cocoa and Forest Initiative commitment to this no deforestation supply chain. And yet, how do you actually do that? And then how do you say it in a credible way that you've made progress or achieved your results? So there's real interest in the ability to communicate sustainability, both around the Ghana Cocoa Standard and around these CFI indicators. And I think that goes way beyond the chocolate cocoa industry to other commodities as well. We need to be able to communicate and have that be perceived as being authentic and reflective of a more holistic sustainability and not just, cherry picking. It's also valued from, based on our advisory working group's view, it's a really good way to track progress on a whole suite of different factors over time, and then maybe something changes and you will come to identify that risk early, and it gives that group of stakeholders working together an opportunity to respond and to say, we were doing really well, deforestation was coming down, and now we have a jump. Oh shoot, what can we do? Where is it happening? How do we respond? And then the third benefit of using LandScale is that it immediately sets up a mechanism, a platform, a process to improve collaboration. In Ghana, we have a habit of everybody works in their silos. There's not great cross-corporate, cross-NGO collaboration. I say that there's some good exceptions to that rule, but both through the GCFRP and through LandScale, they've been bringing us together to do a much better job at collaborating. And I think that's what a landscape approach is all about. So with that, let me open up to your questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really interesting. And I think you've touched on many of the issues that will resonate with many of us on this call. To start the questions, you mentioned that in the first test of the assessment, gathering the data, but where were you able to find most of that data, and where have you found the biggest data gaps are?
So where the data comes from, it's a whole range of places. I think government district level data in Ghana, we have districts to regions to national, right? That's a very reliable source, but it's a very generic source. It's your basics that we would all know. It's not particularly unique or nuanced to sustainability, and the time frame is way off. In terms of looking at ecosystem health data, I think we don't have it all right now, but we're on track to have a lot of that data being produced by the government through REDD+ forest monitoring, through the National Forest Monitoring System. So in this test, some places we have it there, but we know that in 2 years or in 1 year, that we will be solid. Human well-being is much more challenging. And that's something within LandScale. I've been working with the Framework Development Group. Not many sustainability initiatives in the natural resource sort of commodity sectors have been doing very much of this. So we're looking both at social welfare department, we're looking at indicators of progress. So is there progress in developing your governance structures? In both those landscapes, we've been working now for about 2.5 years, so we can chart and document that governance process. And then there's research. I think there's good research out there, but you just have to know where to go. And that's why bringing together different, NGOs, bringing together corporate bodies. And as I talked about, the private sector has a lot of data. It's just they don't want to share it because that's their IP. So how can we come to these comfortable places where they're happy to share for pre-competitive reasons? And I think that's the most exciting, for me, opportunity to tap into. But it's a delicate path.
I think that's really true. And I was going to actually ask how maybe could you speak a bit more about how you started to overcome maybe some of that reluctance to share data?
All about relationships. It's and that's part of this multi-stakeholder approach, is you have to develop relationships. I think luckily Ghana is not a teeny country, but smaller, and the cocoa sector, we all know each other quite well. So if you've been around as long as I have, you become a known, as we say. And then you just start to, I think we have common problems, and we have common goals. And so it's saying, how could we actually work together? If you would share and we would do something, can we both come to a good outcome? But it's helped for the cocoa sector. It helps that we have a body like the World Cocoa Foundation. I'll say in other sectors where you don't have that, then you're going to have to do some of that connectivity work to bring the private sector entities together. And let me also add that we're talking cocoa for these landscapes, but there's timber, there's mining, there's oil palm. So once you get sort of the inner circle engaged, you can then go to the next sort of level of engagement with other stakeholders and probably get better, more improved data. It's all about relationships, in my experience.
Great. I completely agree. And maybe you mentioned where you're talking about the local advisory committee that had supported this process. Can you talk a bit more about who is on that and the role in this work?
So we had it's hosted by the Ghana's Cocoa Board. Their division for research and monitoring chairs the advisory working group. And then we invited in Ghana, we have, the value chain is broken up such that we have buying companies. So they have permits to purchase cocoa beans. And then we have representatives of end user companies like a Nestle, like a Hershey, like a Lindt, right? And so all these different representatives in country were invited to join. I think we have everybody on board, as well as a few key NGOs, some of the partners here under LandScale. And we meet on a quarterly basis and look at different issues. One thing we're working on now is monitoring. So that what I was pointing out, where do you get the data for LandScale? A nice sort of product of all this is that the Lindt Cocoa Foundation has said, okay, we'll come in and provide some funding to help you figure out methods for collecting data in the landscape, because there's some things you're just going to need to go out there and collect. So that advisory working group, private sector, I think we have probably 10, 12 companies represented. We have various members of the Cocoa Board, and then NGOs like NCRC, Solidaridad, ProForest. You don't get everybody every time, but it starts a conversation and keeps it going.
Sorry, muting problem. That's great. Maybe just to switch a bit to the process, and you talked about selecting the indicators and building that. What was the process you went through to choose which indicators, and how much were you involved with the landscape stakeholders in that, or how much did you sort of predefine those yourself?
So to be very honest, we have a number of things going on in terms of landscape stakeholders, and there's two. There's the people, right? There's the Ghanaians, the cocoa farmers, the chiefs. We have a chieftaincy system. We're deeply embedded in process with them of building natural resource governance structures. That's really interesting and exciting. But that's sort of the scope of, if you add too many things on top of that process in the beginning, you overwhelm people. So we haven't actually at this stage brought that to the people of the landscape, though we've talked about the need for monitoring and reporting. With the advisory working group, we've discussed the framework and sought detailed feedback on where can we get data, what are indicators that are already being collected, but at corporate or Cocoa Board level. But at the end of the day, when it came time to test, to select the indicators and then test, we just took a smaller group, largely in-house at NCRC. We went through a debating logical process of, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Guess, where do we think we could get data? That was our starting question. And then we took it back to the advisory working group and we said, do these make sense? Are these okay? Because it's a test, and I think it takes people time to get their heads. The general response was, yeah, that looks good. And so now we've gone out and done that test. I think we just completed in February, and then Ghana went into lockdown in mid-March. So between end of February and mid-March, sadly, we haven't had another advisory working group meeting. We'll probably follow up with a Zoom call sometime soon. And share the results, and then we'll be moving to a second test once the version 2 is ready. Yeah,
great. And just maybe concluding on data, and then I'll move on to some of the other questions.
Yep.
How much, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but just maybe a bit more, how much do you perceive the lack of readily available data as a barrier to the adoption of the LandScale framework? Do you
I think what's good about LandScale, I think lack of data that really hits the scale is real. That's one of the reasons why LandScale is actively looking for data, global data sets. So if you don't have it sitting in front of you, there are global data sets that in the first 1, 2, 3 years, one could use. So we're not expecting perfection right from the get-go, right? It's about progress over time. So if you used a global data set in your first effort, maybe then you strive to 2 years later have figured out a process where you can hone down a bit more and actually reflect landscape level data. But that's where we've been quite lucky. I think we recognized early that some data will need to be collected from the landscape. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have a PhD or be sort of, a scientist at Oxford to be able to do this. Let's put together a landscape monitoring and evaluation system with robust methods that the average person and community and extension officers could do that can help that can then start to generate the type of data we're looking for. So in partnership with this LandScale initiative, that's with our Lint Cocoa Foundation money, we're also trying to figure out for Ghana, and I would say you can probably take it up to countries in the sub-region. Here's some basic methods for how you could collect data that hit these common criteria and indicators. So it's highly likely that you will need to collect your own data at some scale.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to some questions around you. Obviously, Ghana and cocoa are very intertwined, and I think we touched on this a bit earlier as well, but cocoa companies are obviously interested in the impacts of their actions, which are naturally focused on those cocoa producers. But as you've acknowledged, sustainability across a whole landscape depends on other sectors too. So you've talked about the kind of the initial phase of working with the landscapes and that kind of trouble, but where are you and how far have you got in the engagement with some of the other sectors, and what are your plans to expand that in the future?
So we have a vision, especially in Juabi Sopia. I think there's an opportunity with the timber industry. We as NCRC have been developing a relationship working with one of the biggest timber producers in Ghana. We haven't yet, because we want to take the first step of fully testing and launching LandScale with a frame on cocoa. But I think our vision is in a year or two down the road, when we can bring in the new stakeholders and then integrate that aspect. I think there's a lot of in Khartoum, there's just outside the boundaries, there's a major oil palm plantation, but they source a lot of their palm oil from outgrowers in the Khartoum landscape. So that's also another, we're in the early days of thinking about discussing how could you then, wrap that in. However, what we found is if you take, too many stakeholders and throw everybody together all at once, it gets complicated. I think it's better to start smaller and progress and find a core with whom you can find common ground. And like you said, companies have been comfortable working on their own initiatives and in their own way. Asking companies to work together in and of itself within this industry is a big step. And I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill. I would laud the chocolate industry for really taking a bold step. I think what they've committed to is tremendous. And now they're going, we got to achieve this. Here we are, help us do it. But if you bring too many others on board right now, I think we would fall out of balance. So for me personally, I think that's in 2 years' time would be our goal.
And maybe we're reaching the end of the time for Q&As now, but I see many more questions coming in. So we will ensure that all of these questions are answered in the various feedbacks. But perhaps just to conclude this section, could you maybe talk a little bit about kind of what you expect the likely changes would be in sort of version 2? What have you learned from this first stage, and what do you hope to see as version 2 starts to roll out?
I think there's version 2. We've had a real deep think about who is LandScale targeting. I think there's a desire to say it's not just about commodities, but it's also about extractives, that it should be, available to any natural resource impacting, so anything happening in the landscape. But I think we've gone around that circle and really debated it. I can't actually say where we've landed. It's still a dialogue, but you need to start somewhere. And so I think the core is on commodities, and then the positive challenge is, how could we bring in a framework that reflects what a mining corporate is doing, or reflects what timber is doing? So in that framework development, how do you make criteria and indicators that are either diverse enough to be cross-cutting, or do we have to start to tailor and be specific, maybe modules, to particular industries or sectors? So that's been something from version 1 as we're going into version 2. We've been, throwing that ball around quite extensively. Stay tuned. I don't think we've fully landed. And if you have an opinion, one thing I can say about the LandScale process is it's very, very open to, if you want to know something, if you have an opinion about something, we're really listening.
Great.
Maybe too much. Sometimes you just got to make a decision.
Very true. But it's great to have had this kind of real life example and to really see how it's iterated, and particularly in a session or in a sector where there is so much interest, and as you say, really an opportunity to build, and we look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. For those of you who've been sending questions, we will make sure they are answered. We will share those with Rebecca and the other LandScale team, and they will be in the Hoover app as at the end of the session. We are now going to move on to the next part of the program. This is where we're going to get technical. So we're moving into the workshop phase. In this workshop, we're going to explore the types of claims that different stakeholders may want to make and discuss how to make those claims credible. We're going to break into several groups. Those of you who are on Zoom, you will go into a breakout group, and you've been pre-selected. So in a moment when we get to that stage, you will receive a button, click on it, you will automatically join a breakout group where you will find a moderator and a rapporteur for each session.
And Emma, just to note, I'm stepping back, so someone else needs to load it back up so that you guys have control.
Great. We will. I will hope somebody technical is listening to that.
I'm not in charge anymore.
Okay, so Rebecca will not be putting us into breakout groups, but I'm sure this will happen. So in the discussions, we'd love to hear from you about, what is it that really would help you to make these claims? What kind of claims is it that you're looking for? We're going to have about 45 minutes for this, so there should be a good chance to really share and to go into more depth. The breakout groups will be led by Sophie Percy, Renata Lozano from LandScale, Sophie Percy is from Rainforest Alliance and LandScale, and Tony Hill from ProForest. ProForest are one of LandScale's global partners, and they've been playing a key role in the development of the verification and claims mechanisms. As we go into the breakout sessions, please keep your cameras on and remember to unmute when you wish to speak. As I mentioned, if you're in Zoom, you will go into a breakout group. If you're watching this through Hoover, we will broadcast one of the breakout rooms there, so you can watch. You won't be able to speak in that session. And then around 6 p.m., maybe a few minutes before, as we're a little ahead of time, we will come back and have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the discussions and pull out some final thoughts. So can I check? Are we ready to go into the breakout groups? So in the next, I've seen it come up. So please join the breakout groups, and we will see you back here in about 45 minutes. Welcome back. I know there were some issues with the breakout room, so I hope most of you were able to join and participate in some rich and interesting discussions. We're now going to hear back from some of those discussions. I will ask each of the rapporteurs to give us some of the highlights, maybe some reflections on common challenges, but also ideas on how to move this forward. So I'd like to first go to Andreas, who I believe was the rapporteur for the group 1. And maybe you can share with us some of the key takeaways from your discussion, Andreas.
Right, okay, thank you very much. I presume I have some 5 minutes. So basically we started with what type of claims people would like to make, and we broke them up, or they are broken up in process, action, and performance claims. And then, for instance, we said that the rate of deforestation, the rate of living income, carbon storage, or biodiversity protection would be kind of performance claims. We briefly went into discussion what is a claim actually, which was then defined as a message to be communicated to sell a product. based upon also ICIL's definition. And then, for instance, what type of biomass or carbon has been protected? So that is usually a question very interesting to funders or financiers. So that message to cross to the customers, that's quite a big issue. So or financing agencies are of course also very interested in, for instance, IUCN endangered species identification, so the conservation and biodiversity aspect of activities, and here baseline mapping and monitoring systems, whether they are in place. So that's a very important issue, basically the evidence of occurrence of biodiversity. We talked about basically claims as a decision-making tool for financiers. So that's an important issue. However, we also discussed that this is very often out of the control of one particular company. And the risk cannot be managed by one company alone in a landscape. So financing institutions might find it at times challenging to finance particular companies, as they are not really connected to other companies also having an impact in the landscape. So maybe they have to turn the request down. So that's a potential, let's say, that makes the LandScale approach very attractive. One issue could also be whether a platform is in place or multi-stakeholder partnership is in place. So which very often we follow with the jurisdictional approach. So that was for the first part of the discussion. Then we went to credibility of claims. So basically, what are key requirements in order to prove the credibility? Where we basically talk about the governance of such a system. So who is actually in charge, or who could actually make statements? How often those statements being done? So should there be statements on core pillars of activities, or individual and very site-specific? So that's probably a discussion which is still going on very much within LandScale. And whether what have we discussed here? Okay, whether we should do on a regular basis every year statement, or the issue of having a baseline survey. So baseline surveys are usually very expensive. So at the beginning, we discussed, do we go basically for the perfect baseline data and then start working, or do we say, okay, we do have some data and therefore let's go and get started, and in the process of the project we might enrich the data, and but we're gonna address the issue in the landscape. So basically also working with imperfect data. So it was very much mentioned that we have to be realistic. I think that was it in a nutshell. I'm sorry if I've missed anything. The team might also add in case I have missed something.
That's great. Thank you, Andreas. And this goes for everyone who participated, if there's something that you feel has been missed from your rapporteur, please add it in the chat, and we'll make sure to pull it together at the end. Moving on to the second group discussion, I believe, Sarah, you were the rapporteur in the end for that, so perhaps you could also report back and maybe reflect on where you perhaps had similarities or differences with what we've heard from Andreas in the first discussion.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in the first part of the discussion on what kinds of claims to make, I think we focused more about like the categories of claims than the specific topics within each of the pillars about them. So more like what came up was an interest in claims about, how do you capture when action within a landscape is adding up to some sort of critical mass of impact. So it's not just, you're working with a certain number of farmers or you're restoring a certain area. But when does that not become just a site-based intervention? It's actually something that impacts what's happening at the landscape scale. So there's interest in those kinds of claims. There was a few comments that progress and improvement claims are just as important, if not more, than sort of overall positive outcomes at the landscape scale. So a lot of interest in being able to show what is the progress of a landscape. And emphasis on something I've heard a lot as well with our pilots, of importance of showing progress early on. So thinking about the importance of what are claims or assertions you could make about progress in the first couple of years as you're waiting to be able to show progress over time. We had an interesting discussion about attribution being something a lot of people were interested in, but that being really challenging, and discussing of there's contribution claims where you can say that there's action happening in the landscape that are contributing to landscape outcomes, versus attribution claims, which is specifically saying, this is happening because of this intervention or because of this suite of actions being taken. And so, we, in the discussion around that, one point that came out was transparency as being really important in tackling that, where if it's hard to be showing attribution, using transparency to sort of say, here's potentially our theory of change, here's the baseline level of improvement, what are you aiming for, what are your actions and the actions of others, as a way to potentially tackle that. Yeah, I think also another point about positive regeneration, that there's sort of increasing interest in not just showing that you're not having a negative impact on the landscape, but claims about showing that you're actually having a positive impact. And then I think lastly on this topic, we discussed that one point of credibility was not just being able to say, what is positive that's happening, but also to be able to talk about what sort of are some of the weak points or problems that are happening in the landscape, and actually being able to point to the challenges and the risks that landscapes are facing actually adds credibility to the other claims being made, because it's not like all of this is just improving and we're going to solve it. There's always going to be challenges that have to be addressed. So that's another point sort of linked to credibility and transparency. In terms of other points on credibility, we talked a fair amount about sort of who within a landscape can be making claims, and the role of the multi-stakeholder partnership or platform within that, and how that partnership needs to be a part of sort of arbitrating who can be making changes. But if the partnership is going to be then the one about making claims credible, there has to be a certain amount of due diligence on that partnership to make sure that it is actually credible itself. So we talked a bit about LandScale has been considering adding an additional pillar specifically focused on assessing the landscape partnership. And discussed that there could be interesting ways to think about how you could use third-party verification or some sort of independent review of the nature of the partnership to assess credibility of them to be assessing who could be making claims, as well as thinking about how to incorporate sort of landscape partner track records. So, if there's information about who's been doing work in the landscape for a while versus who may have had challenges in the past. I think was the majority of our conversation. So I think I've covered everything, but yeah, from the group, please feel free to chime in if I've missed anything or misrepresented anything. It was a really interesting discussion.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And to our last group, Isabel.
Yes, so we were a group of 12 people working really on different continents. So all of us, we shared a little bit about our projects we are working on and what type of claims we want to make there. So most of us were working in watershed management projects in Ethiopia, Malaysia, Mexico, and then specifically from Morocco, argan oil project. So each of the project was sharing their claims. So I would say we had mostly the multi-stakeholder process claims and the performance claims. Those were the most mentioned in all of those projects, and then only marginally the contribution of different actors to processes. But then we also discussed that it's really very context specific, which of these claims are key to start working with. And often in watershed management projects, which are very holistic, then maybe all of them in a way are important and should be touched upon. Yeah, I think that's a little bit that discussion in a nutshell. Maybe just also to mention the project were also about clean energy wash and tourism, and what are the effects of upstream, downstream, if you need clean water downstream. Right, I think that was it for the first point. And then moving on to the credibility of claims. There, the discussion started that different actors are understanding maybe data results differently. They're not really speaking the same language. So then there is a challenge. How can you really then assess those different claims and make them credible? Or another point was mentioned that greenwashing should be avoided, which can happen through private companies sometimes. And there specifically external verification is needed. Some of the projects are just starting, so they couldn't really share yet already that much of information. But we also then came to an agreement that for verification specifically, a combination is important, let's say from the people working together in the landscape, that they have a participatory monitoring, and through that there is also a trust building component, they're believing in the data. But then at the same time, this should be combined with external or peer review of the data. Then the issue of transparency was mentioned, that is really key in the whole process. And then we were diving more onto economic aspects in the case of Morocco, of eco-label of argan oil. Let me see. And then, yeah, we landed up on the point of time stamp, time bound. And then also, can we use maybe data information from previous projects to make our performance claims or not? And then the time was off. So please, the group, if somebody wants to add, feel free to add your points.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you all for the report back. I think what we hear there is there remain so many questions, but this really provides an opportunity to start and iterate and bring together lessons and different actors. And we look forward to seeing LandScale developing and working with many of you to build on those lessons and share them across different landscapes. We're coming to the end of our Rainforest Alliance session within the Global Landscapes Forum. So I would like to thank all of you for participating, for joining the different sessions, for bearing with us through the technicalities of an online conference. As we said at the beginning, I think the systemic shift to positioning landscapes at the center of development and environmental strategies are really key as we move forward. The 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people partnership is a key example of how, if we work together in stronger alliances, we can really work towards that sustainable future. We very much enjoyed sharing with you some of the experiences of partners that we work with and we continue to build our alliances with. We will, through the Hoover Hub, continue to share follow-up to questions raised and different feedback that you've given, and do, of course, keep an eye out on the GLF conference page and Twitter feed for further follow-up. It is now nearing the end of our session, so I will thank you all once again. We look forward to welcoming you at another session in the near future, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day wherever you're listening to us. Thank you once again.